All right, you've got 4:01 and you're live.
Okay, this is the May 18th meeting of the Community Advisory Board Review Committee. And I'm going to call the roll. Lena Carson.
Here.
Dave Risberger.
Here.
Luke Murphy.
Here.
Also joined by Acting Chief Lieutenant Chris Witzenberg and Personnel Director Katie Butker. And I'm not going to review the ground rules for this for those folks who are looking at this on YouTube. And I see that there are a number. You can review those ground rules by going back to any of the other previous meetings. But I do want to move ahead with a couple of housekeeping items to start with, if I could. And I did send out this draft language, nothing that we need to go over right now. This is more for information's sake for everyone. But you'll see, if you've had an opportunity to open the PDF, that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 recommendations that require review from the starting blocks. And then there are a couple that we need to revisit through either the appendix, as we've talked about, or community engagement. And then within the context of those 11, and this is something I thought maybe we should figure out more now, and then we can move forward with it, having had a plan. We're going to want to look at council opinion on a couple of these, specifically 1L and 2I. I think those are the only two that require council opinion. And I'd like to entertain some discussion as to how we make that happen. Do we wait until we present this in its entirety, or do we present this to council, in which case, in what fashion, how would that look? Thoughts? Bueller? Dave? Luke, go ahead.
Yeah, this is just kind of spitballing it here, but I'm wondering if it might make sense to kind of do it within the context of the whole report. Once we, perhaps what we can do is when we send this out for the council to look at, we can send as well the two question areas, 1L and the second one. If we send it in the context of the entire report, it might give it a little more contextualization.
Yeah, we also are looking at this thing getting in front of council, what do we say, Len, 10 days ahead, right? That, and my concern is that there's going to wind up being public hearing. That's the point of, right? And we wouldn't want those two things to be
Well, that's fair.
a part of the same conversation, I wouldn't think.
Well, they can't be. The public hearing can't happen until we have a working document that's ready to be signed by the mayor after we vote on it.
So what's your thought, Dave? In terms of,
I don't know. I guess it bothers me a little bit that we're going back, and it seems like we're as a committee, we were supposed to go back with a document for presentation to the council to then make a motion on, second, discuss, vote. And what we have is a document that is going to be partially done. If we're sending some of these items to the council for discussion, I wouldn't put these in with the rest of this document then. Okay. I would pull them completely out. Have the main document be a point of discussion and vote, and then bring up the items that we couldn't agree on at a later time, but set a time for where they're going to be discussed. It may be legislative committee they're discussed, and explain to the council. If the council then disagrees, that's their prerogative as a group to do something different with it. But it's our job to come forward with the recommendations to the council.
Let me tell you what my timeline is for this. I think it's one that still is in sync with what our original plans were, which is to plow through all of our recommendations. And we're, again, we have 11 minus those 2 for council means we have 9 that we plow through. We wordsmith, we agree, or we just decide that it's not going to get into the final document. Then we go. We can either go into timeline stuff for these each individually, or and I'm of 2 minds about it, we can go into the appendix and look at the options that we have now that we have a more fully formed idea of what our document looks like, as to whether or not any of these recommendations, any of those proposals might make some sort of sense. So it could be that we do the timeline next on the other side of our going through the last of these 9 recommendations, or we do the appendix. So either or is going to be fine with me. And if you guys have a thought on that, I'm happy to entertain them. Luke?
Sorry to keep jumping at the
No, please.
questions here.
Yes.
My thought about establishing timeline, it might, since the bulk of these recommendations require so much discussion, it might just be easier to wait on doing the timeline until, unless I've got a fan in the background, so I apologize if I misheard you. Since the bulk of our time is going to require getting on the same page, it might be easier to save that to the end once we're all on the same page with the recommendations than talking about the timeline.
In terms of having gone to the appendix prior to going into the timelines.
Correct.
And I'm perfectly fine with that, but I want to make sure we have consensus. Dave, Len, you have thoughts?
So the document that we're creating is supposed to be to the council when?
We'd like to, well, our deadline is the 1st. I actually was talking to the mayor, he's popped in on a couple of these things and he's seen the process and asked me whether or not that was a reasonable expectation, or if it made sense, more likely to be a few days post that, so that we were looking at it being presented 10 days prior to the June, I guess it's 15th council meeting. I told him, frankly, we're working at the speed that it needs to go at. It doesn't matter to me. I'd like to be done with this, but we need to do the job that we need to do. So so that's, so the concern for me is that we don't want to complicate things. And I think it was Dave suggested we just pull the 2 items for council. I think that was you, Dave. Those 2 items for council discussion out of the package, and have that conversation uniquely with the council. And we look at our appendix after we get through with our last 9 recommendations as the next step up for us. And then we go into our timelines based on having made decisions around all of the language and as whether what we might recommend or not relative to the suggestions made in the appendix.
Agreed. The only part, I guess, on Dave's recommendation, that I'd rather have full council, because if it goes to legislative, then the only new council member introduced would be John Rafter.
Okay.
Right. Oh, and sorry, Katie Lepartio.
Right.
So, I mean, Luke and Dave, you've already covered this. So to get the other 2 involved, which would be Mark Davies and Scott Harrington.
Right.
We probably should just go to full council.
And I'd like to stay, I would obviously like to be able to stay involved in that too. I hate to walk away from those last 2 council.
Correct. I would also, I'd like to be able to participate as a full council in those discussions.
Right. Okay, so
excuse me, Mark.
Dave.
Do we only have? I'm looking at what you wrote up, and I apologize. My notes are everywhere. Do we only have 2 items that are recommended to go back to council? It looks like we have quite a few more.
No, just 2.
Because there's like under 4, you have highlighted A, B, D. Under 5, you've got A is highlighted.
Yes, those are all either pending legal opinion. That's the thing that we're doing right now, or in the case of A under 4, that's something.
Oh, I see.
and we say we'd come back to because we needed to have a little bit more fully formed based on the legal opinions that we're pulling in now.
Yeah, because as it is right now, I mean, I would hope we would have some kind of legal opinion on those before we send this to council. I wouldn't want to pull this many out.
No,
It's okay to pull a couple out, but to pull out a lot would be.
it would just be the two, and
Yeah.
plus, I would suggest, for what it's worth, and you guys tell me what you think, but we haven't discussed them. We haven't done anything with the two that go to council. We just identified them in that first meeting as we were determining what goes where, as something that required council input. But I think there's probably some value we get to the tail end of things, that we at least have some review of them, even as we're not weighing in. So that we're, maybe a little bit more familiar with what it is that we're sending to council. Even
I
though
would like to see that, Mark, that we kind of finalize our language.
yeah. But I want to give council, as we've been tasked, a final document that is, essentially the recommendations, as we have spent, these last 6 or 7 weeks working on. I feel very comfortable with the work we've done, that these are the recommendations of this committee. It goes to council. These are the timelines that we have, et cetera, et cetera. If there's going to be, per the appendix, any other kind of, group that's brought to this or not, that'll be our recommendation or not. And then the council will, be able to present that for public opinion and for public comment, and then vote on it. And then, we can take a look at these two other, recommendations that we've already identified as per council, prior to our calling this done, with, as far as we're concerned, done. Okay, so I just want to make sure we're kind of on the same page. And again, you'll see, I still have some work. YouTube, I thank God for it, because it's been great to get the exact verbiage. But I still have a couple that I have to make sure I've got exactly the right text. And that's section 5, D and E. I know where it is. It's just listening to me talk, which is painful. So, all right. So I think we have a plan then. We're all agreed. We know where we're going. Okay. All right. So with that, then let's, where we left off was we had F, 2F, where we determined that 1 and 2 were things through legal opinion and our discussion, we were able to wordsmith and generate as finished. And then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, there was a repetition of 3 of those in there anyway, but in any case, they were all struck. So they're not included in this document. And they won't be. There's no reason, I don't think, to present to council something that we decided against.
Mark, I'm sorry, say that one more time. We're
Yeah.
on 2F, and which
Yeah,
one?
so 2F, what we didn't do with 2F was the main intro paragraph.
Mhm.
We went right away to number 1, which is the use of force, and actually both 1 and 2 were about use of force policies. And then we looked at 3 and 5, I think, or 8, whatever it is, the other 3 that were still listed, and they were listed in this weird sequence because there are actually 3 in the main document that are just a typo. It's just repeated. So we basically, we went through all of those, 3 additionals besides the 1 and 2 they're showing here, and we struck them each. They, at the end of the meeting, none of them were anything that we were going to advance. They were either included absolutely in other things, or they were just nothing that we felt that we could advance. So we wind up with 1 and 2 under F, under 2F, the sub paragraphs that we have agreed to. We haven't actually tackled 2F, the main body paragraph, the intro paragraph. So that's something that we'll need to do. And we did kind of skip around a little bit in that we didn't do, I think it was because we had Dave Merzick here and I need to take advantage of that. But we had 2A that required legal opinion, and same thing with 2B. And what I'd like to do is kind of pick up there, 2A and 2B. We don't have Dave here, but we do have the opinions of both the DEA and the public defender. And we can, I think, go off of those at least for conversation. If we need to hold off for Dave Mertzik joining us, I think we can do that. But I would just want to continue, pushing through. And we are in the sticky part of this in that we took all the legal opinion stuff, which is obviously going to be more complicated, and moved that to essentially the section that we're doing now. So, so that's my suggestion. And if that works for everybody, I'd like to dive back in. That works for all?
Yeah, that's
Just to
fine, Mark.
clarify,
I also
Mark.
would just like to recognize that Chief Witzenberg is only going to be with us for
Till
another-
5:30. Yes,
Yeah.
you're right. So we may be able to do some things at 5:30 when the chief leaves or not, but at the very least we can do this. So I'm going to read the recommendation 2A, and then I'm going to see if I can find the legal opinions that we do have that are respective to that. And that is, so under 2, use of force, officer conduct, additional trainings, personnel, and recruitment, we have recommendation A. This board recommends that the Common Council instruct OPD to create a policy that, if it has not done so, balances officers' First Amendment rights with the necessity of appearing to be unbiased. It is recommended that the policy include language stating that the display of symbols associated with white supremacist groups or social media posts or other statements made elsewhere that come to light that are evidence of racial animus or other prejudice against a protected category are grounds for termination. For a full list of symbols associated with hate groups, they've got a website. So I want to go to the legal opinions that have been offered before I turn this to, I think, Katie for an opinion about that termination piece. So what we have from the DA is on 2A. I certainly have no issues with this recommendation, but question why only white supremacist groups are addressed instead of all supremacist groups. They are, in fact, Black, Hispanic, and Asian supremacists that exist. By only addressing white supremacist groups, this recommendation is itself, by definition, racist. So, and as far as Bob goes, the public defender has no comment, although it should be all hate groups. So actually, he's in concurrence with John. So, so those are the 2 legal opinions that we have. They both essentially are saying the same thing. Katie, for me, the piece that jumps out at me is the piece about termination. And so I want to go to you if I could.
Yeah, this is really tricky. And I think that I probably, before giving you a full final answer, would rather consult with our labor council just to kind of, take their temperature on this. But of course, what this really comes down to is on-duty political activity, right? I mean, that's kind of what's the basis here. So I would say that is already prohibited by, the city's ethics policy, by other, perhaps even there might be a standard operating procedure within the department. Chief Witzenberg would have to correct me. He's shaking his head yes. So I think that all that is really a non. I don't want to call it a non-issue, but I think that that's already provided for in existing policy. I mean, when I've read through this and just understanding anecdotally, I think a lot of the concerns are about, political activity that is perhaps done off duty or on private social media accounts where people are identifying themselves as an officer or something like that. So that's where it gets really sticky. Mark, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
You're giving me the look. I wasn't sure.
No. You keep going. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. So I think as far as, based on what's in the recommendation, I understand, the justification for it, but I think that a lot of it is, is covered again by our ethics policy and by operating procedures established in the department. Not to say that this is not a legitimate concern of the community, of course.
So before I go to the chief, so what is the current penalty as best as you are aware, Katie?
So The current penalty is really, I mean, it's somewhat subjective. I mean, it's really nuanced depending on the infraction, how many times it's happened. You know, if we have somebody who is, and you know, there's also the concept of progressive discipline. So if we had somebody who came in wearing, you know, some sort of political button on their uniform one time, I'd imagine that the appropriate, you know, action would be for the chief to, you know, tell the person, listen, you're in duty, you're in uniform, take it off. I mean, a second instance of the same conduct would perhaps result in a counseling memorandum, and then, you know, the you know, actual discipline thereafter. It would also depend on, you know, again, I'm giving the example of wearing a political badge or button on your uniform. I mean, that's not quite as serious as something like, you know, perhaps an officer appearing in uniform at a political rally of some kind and identifying themselves as an officer of the city of Oneonta, which would of course be a bigger infraction and therefore result in a higher penalty.
All right, Lieutenant, can I ask you to weigh in on this, please?
We have several policies in place that address these issues. For example, including but not specifically limited to the tattoo policy, public conduct, racial, ethnic, and discrimination profiling prohibition policy, as well as policies in place that prohibit officers for endorsing anything politically while representing the city of Oneonta in any capacity.
Okay. All right, so policies exist currently, and we're going to throw this to committee discussion, but to be clear, so Katie, policies currently exist. Chief, there is, as Katie was suggesting, probably a progressive sort of a methodology of dealing with infractions, starting with what the heck are you doing to, you know, and termination, which is the thing that jumps out at me here, isn't the go-to option. That is a somewhere in the context of all of this, that is an option, but it certainly isn't the first option.
Right.
I think it all depends on the severity of the infraction and what it is. I mean, if there's certain criminal conduct, then it, you know, obviously it would be grounds for immediate charges. So, you know, there's also legal stuff at play here too, where the officers are bound by conduct to obey the law, right? So if they in fact do violate any protections of the law that people have, then they could be prosecuted criminally as well as through the civil service process.
I think that ultimately compliance with this comes down to just good management. I mean, so really, if we have somebody who's, you know, outright and blatantly disregarding a city policy or directive, then that becomes an insubordination charge under civil service law as much as it's about the political activity. So I think that, you know, we have to keep that part in mind too.
All right, I want to throw this to Luke to start, and you know, Luke, this is, you know, you're the representative of these folks, so it's always going to be painful to start off with you, but at least you know it's coming. So so where's your take on this? It seems like we have policies in place.
Yeah, no, it sounds like we do, and it sounds like they're in place. This is largely, again, it's not a problem that we see at Oneonta, just to make sure that the policies are there. Again, we did our best to read all the policy that was out there, but sometimes get to everything. So ensuring that this policy is enshrined, and you know, the spirit behind it is ensuring folks are protected. And I think with the policy that we have, especially the leadership that we have, I trust that will be followed.
So Luke, were you able to find this? So your group was looking. Were you able to find these policies, or was the fact that you weren't able to find these policies the rationale for the recommendation?
The rationale, this happened at a time when there was growing, a lot of these recommendations were made at the time when there was intense amount of political friction. So to be honest with you, I cannot remember which policy we were looking at particularly, but this was going on at the same time. Well, we're still seeing a lot of brutality towards Asian Americans as well as African Americans. So it was really designed to really emphasize that Oneonta has taken a stand against this.
Okay. Dave, Len?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I have a couple questions for Katie. Katie, is there, well, and the lieutenant, has there been a history at any point where we've had officers that were charged with ethics violations of this nature? And whether or not we have or haven't, what mechanism do we have in place right now if you have an officer that somebody sees them and they feel they've broken this policy? What's the mechanism that we have in place for them to report this up the chain?
Chris, you want to go first?
Well, I think we've made the reporting through the website easier. We've also taken and modified the complaint form for the department. The nice thing here is that we've got body camera video now. And for an officer to fail to put their body camera on is a violation of policy. And we can just take a look. We can go to the tape. So it's there. There's no changing it. Once it's there, it's documented. So I have a racial ethnic profiling and discrimination prohibited policy sitting right in front of me, and I'd be able to go back and take a look at that to determine whether or not there was a reason for the complaint to be made and if it was substantiated or not.
But who does the reviewing as of right now? Let's say somebody comes forward, they make a complaint. Who does the reviewing?
It would be the initial sergeant would be able to look into it and push it up the chain. Generally, they come through my office, or the office of the lieutenant would be where they go directly. They can be made anonymously and dropped off, and then the lieutenant or I could assign somebody to do the review, which would generally be a sergeant, and then the sergeant would give us a report, and we would look at the report and make sure that it coincided with what actually happened and be able to make a determination then.
Okay. And have we had a history of this happening at any point?
We haven't had a history. The most recent in memory would be the Bradford Shanks incident,
right?
Which I think was a lot less based on race than it was with one particular officer conduct.
Yeah, and I don't want to I don't think we need to rehash that, what went on or anything, but I was curious if there was anything of recent memory. So, all right, thank you.
Len?
It seems to me that the city of Oneonta has a ethics policy that covers this, along with standard operating procedures in the Oneonta Police Department in place to take preventive and corrective measures. And ultimately, we have a personnel director that must follow New York State civil service procedures.
So, Len, I know you're saying that because you're probably writing it too, which I appreciate.
I've got most of it in place.
Yeah, no, I got to tell you, God bless you. Getting people to write these things is huge. Still looking at you, Luke. Over How have you read?
I wrote a lot of it.
I know. You did some homework. All right. So what I would add to it, though, it seems to be a recurring theme, is that we need to make certain that the public can find this information. That the information specifically being that there are, rules and regs that apply, and that there are expectations, and there's really no reason for this recommendation outside of the fact, as best as I can see it, that people didn't believe or probably didn't know that there was any policy in place. So I feel like it's important. Luke, if you weren't able to find it or your group wasn't able to find it, I think that's a key piece to be aware of. So like a lot of things, it seems, Chief, that the police department is, on top of a lot. I mean, there's a level of accreditation that you've gotten for a reason. So my expectation is that a lot of this is information that needs to be maybe a little bit more forward facing. So that was me rambling to give you enough time to finish writing, Len.
City of Oneonta already has a ethics policy in place covering this recommendation, along with Oneonta Police Department has standard operating procedures in place to create preventive and corrective measures for the officers, along with following New York State Civil Service.
Yeah. So the only thing I would say is that we're not going to be responding to the recommendation with our recommendations, but rather we should probably say something along the lines, as we have with a lot of other things, that OPD should continue its policy of.
Okay.
So when you get that, if you want to make a motion, unless there's further discussion, well, either way, I guess it works. That's the damn Robert's rules.
So Mark, you want me, instead of saying the city, you want me to say OPD already has standard operating procedures in place to prevent and or corrective measures for officers, also utilizing the city ethics policy and following New York State Civil Service?
Yeah, I think my suggestion would be that it would be more something along the lines of OPD shall provide links to its current policies of such and such and such and such on its website, just so that what we're doing is we're saying we know that they have that, but we need to make sure people know it. And so therefore, what's the issue is that they, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I'm in 100% agreement. I think the biggest problem here is not having this information out for people to see. And I think that it's all about creating that level of communication and trust between OPD and the community and back and forth. I think I agree. I think we have the policy. I think this statement that we have here should acknowledge that, but then direct OPD to have that policy available front and center for people to see.
Yeah.
OPD will provide public access to department standard operating procedures and ethic policy while following New York State Civil Service rules, or is it procedures? I don't know, Katie, which one is it?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Rules.
Does that work, Mark?
It works for me. Luke, Dave?
Sounds good.
Okay, so Len, you're going to make the motion
I'll make a motion of what I just read.
and I'll second it. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, very good. So,
May I just say one concluding comment?
of course.
I wanted to thank the committee. Again, some of these things, it was harder for us to find than others, and thanks everyone here for their patience. It's never racist to challenge power, and I encourage our DA to increase his understanding of racial history in this country.
Okay, so we'll go on to B. Again, same section, use of force, officer conduct, additional trainings, personnel and recruitment. B, this board recommends that the Common Council instruct OPD to create a policy, if it has not done so already, that addresses political activity while on duty. I feel like we're reading the same thing. In uniform or while officially representing the department or the city. This policy should address the displaying of political symbols in OPD property, including symbols worn on uniforms, participation in political events, appearing in political advertisements, or while writing op-ed or other publicized opinion matters. This board feels strongly that all political activity, including but not limited to what has been described herein, be prohibited while on duty in uniform or while otherwise officially representing the city or OPD. This recommendation should not be construed to interfere with or deny any normal, reasonable rights for employees of OPD to express or engage in political activity as a private citizen. And I just want to go ahead, Glenn.
I would just like to recognize the discussion that we've already had in place
Yep.
over 2A, that this would be answered by our conclusion and
Perfect.
answer to that recommendation. And
Yeah,
I'm just wondering if we could just strike 2B, recognizing that we answered that in 2A.
It would seem to me, but let me ask Katie. There's a slight difference between the two of these recommendations in my mind's eye, which is there. It's while on duty, addresses political activity while on duty. So really, there is no difference between these two things. I thought as I was reading it that we were talking about, it does say at one point actually that something that is, well, let's see if I can find it. Op-ed, writing op-ed or other publicized opinion matters. Now that's not something that's done on duty. The paragraph references on duty, but then moves to this idea of writing op-eds or providing some other, one would suspect social media. Go ahead, Luke.
I apologize if this wasn't clear. The idea behind this was not to, I mean, if a police officer wants to write an op-ed, by all means, but the idea was not to sign it Sergeant OPD, for example, if it's a political op-ed, because we don't want there to be the impression that OPD is politicized one way or the other.
And Katie, is that then, is all of that just going to basically fall back into what we had just discussed in the previous?
I believe it does, Mark. I think, it seems to be clear that the committee made a distinction in the language about on duty while in uniform or at any time while you're officially representing the police department. So I think, what they were probably getting at, which is kind of what Luke had said, was, the chief of police writing an endorsement letter to the Daily Star for a certain political candidate. I think any activity that would damage the appearance of neutrality of the department as an entity of the government is really what they're looking to address here. So I think that it does, it is a little different from A in that, it does go a little bit further in terms of, stating when that political activity occurs. I mean, you can be off duty posting something on your private social media account, but identifying as I'm the chief of police of the city of Oneonta, and I think that this mask ordinance is nonsense, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I hate to use something that's the kind of like a recent example, but that's exactly the type of, activity that we wouldn't really expect or tolerate from our officers, right?
I think also the definition of political and political symbols, it's not as narrow as you may think when you first look at this. It could be what's deemed political for one person, somebody else doesn't think it's political at all. And of course, usually those two people have opposite, opposing views on the topic also. So I mean, I hesitate to roll this in with the first one. Maybe if I saw the current policy again, or if somebody could read the current policy again to hear it, but I'm not ready to completely disregard this one just yet.
So
sorry.
The thing that I'm seeing now that it's been discussed a little bit, that is pulls out and makes this more distinctly and uniquely something that we should probably address, is the idea of signing something or in some fashion representing your opinion, whether in print or in person, as a member of the Oneonta Police or hierarchy for that matter. In fact, across the city government, but specific to the OPD. So I think if we just concentrated on that piece that seems to be different in these two paragraphs, as the piece again, there's a rule against it. So again, going back to the way you constructed that previously, that previous recommendation, Len, is that OPD will ensure that its policy, against representing the city or OPD in the context of political opinion or endorsement is prohibited, and suffers the consequence of HR. Go ahead.
So Katie, correct me if I'm wrong here. Our ethics policy takes care of the political side of this recommendation, correct?
I mean, not the city's specific code of ethics, but within other, oh, sorry, Chris has his hand up. I'll defer to him.
So New York State election law, which is actually written into our policy for legislative restrictions, says any person who, being a police commissioner, any officer or member of any police force in a state, who uses or threatens to use his official power or authority in any manner, directly or indirectly, in aid of or against any political party, organizations, association, or society, or control, affect, influence, reward, or punish the political adherence, affiliation, action, expression, or opinion of any citizen, or appoints, promotes, transfers, retires, or punishes an officer or member of police force, or asks for aids in a promotion, transfer, retirement, or punishment, which really doesn't apply, but solicits, collects, or receives any money for a political fund, really can't be involved in any politicking, period, as a police officer in any official capacity.
And that was what again? What rule?
New York State election law, section 17-110.
To expand that to, I think it was Dave, who mentioned the mask ordinance. Was that you, Dave, that say, well, if you don't like the mask ordinance, it probably isn't something that the chief of police wants to put out there?
No, it was Katie, you said that, didn't you?
Ari, yeah, that was me.
No, but it's fine. It's fine. But the point of it is that, so that takes it outside of the realm of political and more into the realm of your opinion on city governance.
It's a grayer area.
It is a grayer area, but can you sign chief of police to your, or does it matter? I mean, if it's a small town and we know who the chief of police is,
Right.
doesn't write chief of police, we still know it's the chief of police. So we're saying that he can't have an opinion that he expresses? That doesn't sound right.
Not in an official
Not
capacity.
in official capacity.
All right. So
The trouble we run into, Mark, and I told our previous police chief when we were talking about this, I said, people want their police officers to seem completely unbiased, no political opinion whatsoever, which, I mean, of course it's not possible, but they want to at least have that appearance, where those of us that sit on the common council, we can be jerks if we want to be, and loud mouths, and people just expect it, and they either listen or they ignore us. And it gets even harder in a small town, because you're right. Lieutenant Witzenberg could write an op-ed and sign his name as Lieutenant Witzenberg, or just write Chris Witzenberg, but people know he's a lieutenant. So I think as long as it's not an official capacity, then I mean, we're going to have to be okay with that.
yeah, I
How
guess
else do you do it?
Yeah. So because there's only there's one thing to say we can't be having in an official capacity police involved in this, that, or whatever. But it's another thing entirely to say, Chris, you can't have an opinion that you ever expressed to anybody.
But there's also, I mean, legal restrictions on us for, like, we're really only able to comment on political discussion if it's of contemporary, what's the exact wording, Katie? It's got to be a matter of contemporary concern.
Mhm. Contemporaneous public interest.
Right, contemporaneous, thank you.
So
And that has to be done in an unofficial capacity, but there is, some First Amendment restrictions on civil servants. However, where civil service is interesting and really separates us from the private sector is that we are still allowed to have our First Amendment rights. Our constitutional rights have to be protected by civil service law to some degree. Now there's, policy in place for us to be restricted to some degree also, and clearly hate speech isn't protected by policy or by ethics for that matter. So I think it's best for everybody to just stay out of it. But for those that don't, there are some restrictions in what it is that they are and they're not able to say officially.
Len's been working.
So Mark, all I did was though, I just added a little bit to combine 2A and 2B. So in thinking of 2A and 2B, I have OPD will provide public access to department SOPs, and ethics policy while following New York State Civil Service rules, New York State Board of Election Law, I think he said 1710, while in their official capacity. It seems like the New York State Board of Elections Law 17, whatever it is,
Take care of it.
takes care of the entire realm of any police officer acting in an inappropriate or endorsement of any sort in policy or in politics.
No, but I think just the addition of the New York State election regulations, for me, that takes care of the piece that was most concerning to me. Luke, I'm going to go back to you.
It's very reassuring to hear that. It sounds like New York election law really covers what we were hoping to do, and to Dave's point, the question of what is and what isn't political, it's a good point. However, it sounds like the law is already covering it, which is great. That means we don't necessarily have to get into the weeds of what's political and what's not.
Okay, then what we're doing is we're going to revise what we had voted on in 2A to be inclusive of both 2A and 2B with the modification that Len just made. I'm not going to make you read that again, Len. I think we've all got it. So I'd like to move that we do that. And if there's somebody, so Len is seconding that. Do we have any further discussion on this, or can we take a vote? We good? Okay, let's take a vote. All in favor? Aye. Good. Okay. Good about that. All right. Now, we do have F, excuse me, the paragraph of F in 2, which we didn't actually address. We addressed all of the sub paragraphs, but I'd like to see if we can tackle this too. And then I think we may have opinions. I'm going to just check really quickly if we have any opinions on 2F, just generally. Yes, we do. Okay, so so if that works for everybody, we're going to do 2F, and that will take care of F. And F, as we already had determined, is going to have some impact on some other things. We might be actually able to go back to one of those that this impacted. So 2F is that this board recommends that the Common Council work with OPD to review and update policing regarding the use of force, specifically requiring a detailed examination of every use of force incident. This review must include a submission to the Common Council for formal review and approval prior to implementation. While this board recognizes the subject matter expertise of OPD regarding this important topic, it is important to recognize that any use of force policy must be consistent with community values. Additionally, this board strongly feels that the Common Council and OPD and/or other future oversight boards should closely and carefully consider the following. And again, we've taken the following, which were 8, 3 of them being typos, so 5, down to 1 and 2, and those are done. So the question is basically in this overview paragraph of to F, and I'm going to read you the legal opinion that was offered by the DA. And he says, what do the members of Common Council of the committee know about police use of force that makes them qualified to review policies, make recommendation, or examine the use of force incident? I also take exception with the assertion that use of force policies must be consistent with community values. Community values should have nothing to do with use of situation. I don't know, as it has nothing to do with community sentiment. I'm either missing a line or it just, his sentence went screwy. But in any case, the gist of his comment was what you heard. I don't think I need to detail it. So that is the extent of legal opinion on this. Again, we do have use of force having been addressed in both 1 and 2. And if it helps at all, I can quickly read those, and they're very short. One is regarding use of force, OPD will be consistent with the letter of the law and the policy guidance of the Division of Criminal Justice Services of New York State. The relative SOPs will be posted to the website. That's 1. OPD will continue to provide use of force policies that provide clear requirements for de-escalation before force is used, except in extraordinary circumstances. I would say that my opinion is that the paragraph, the entry paragraph, is redundant. That these two things that we've already, taken care of. It's an overview of their expectation of what happens within the context of the what is actually 5 unique recommendations, but it's not a recommendation in and of itself. Go ahead, Luke.
I think so, Mark, and I believe later down the line, when we get to talking about the role of an advisory board, this might be one of the topics in that. I have a couple of screens open right now, so I wanted to make sure I was looking at the right spot.
Right.
So that might be a discussion for later on as well.
Okay. Other thoughts? Len, Dave, I don't think Katie or Chris, I think we've kind of hit your buttons on this. So I think I can just keep this in the committee. Len?
So Mark, are you suggesting that we just strike the opening paragraph?
I feel like, we have to have some rationale for 1 and 2 existing within some larger context. And it could simply be that they are F1 and F2. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that again, to your point, Luke, this may very well be something, and I marked it as something we may circle back to when we're talking about advisory boards or whatever might be in the appendix relative to those suggestions. But in terms of what they're, go ahead, Dave.
What we could also do is just change 1 to F and 2 to G and just re-letter everything. If because I feel this is a little bit, as far as recommendations, it's fine, but as soon as it comes to something that's got to be voted on, it's almost like you're voting on the title versus, and then voting again on the subject below the title. I think this was included elsewhere in this, but I think this is more of a structural issue at this point with how it's going to be presented to the council later on.
Right. I'm fine with doing that. It's just going to wind up being a case. I'm doing it by hand, but all of the other recommendations that follow will then wind up jumping up by 1 letter. Not a big deal. But
Mark, kind of to your point and kind of to Dave's point, I kind of like just the F1, F2 and strike that opening paragraph. And then that would.
I'm fine with that.
That would.
So you do want to cross these all out for another reason.
Yeah.
So
no, I think
F1 and F2, just keep them as a combo, basically. F is the use of force. And actually that could just be F is use of force : and then 1 and 2.
Yeah.
I think, Mark, this is Luke. I think that sounds reasonable.
All right, good. Rid of my scorecard. All right. Okay. Okay, very good. So that takes us now to H, which we tabled H pending further discussion because it was tied in with F. And I think that this is a good place for us to come back to H. So this is 2H, if that works for everybody. I have to figure out now where H is. There it is. So I literally did cross all those. Okay, 2H. And again, we did look at this and we said we'd come back to it. So this is where we come back to it. This board recommends this council encourage OPD to develop policies and procedures that go above and beyond policing best practices. It is H, isn't it? GH, yes. Many members of the board laud the fact that OPD is accredited, New York State accredited police agency, and recognize the significant ongoing work that goes into being an accredited agency. OPD's policies, to the best knowledge of this board, remain in line with the standards set by NYSAPA. To further strengthen OPD's standing, it must further align use of force procedures with community standards as indicated in recommendation F in this subsection, which is why we tabled that. So what they're asking is that OPD develop policies and procedures that go above and beyond policing best practices. That's essentially the nut at the heart of this, right?
Right, and we had the chief commented on about it, and I think we all agreed that we didn't want to go above and beyond the standards because that puts us in a subjective position, and we don't want to be in a subjective position. And we recognized the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Service.
Right. So given that, Luke, I think, to hear where you think we should go with this.
You know, I think a lot of good points were made, and I think there's a lot of change happening from Albany, and what best practices is changing and becoming more and more of above and beyond of what we were talking about. I think a good point was made that being kind of on the forefront is a good thing in a lot of cases, but given our resources, given the reality of the budgets within the city, best practices might be the best we can do, which is great. I mean, best practices is great. You know, the idea with this, a lot of us, you know, in the community are in positions where we're, you know, best is good. Let's always try to be better was kind of the idea behind this recommendation.
So if we were to say, rather than striking it entirely, if we were to say that OPD, that the council recommends that OPD continues to make every effort to stay at the forefront of best practices in policing.
I think that sounds reasonable,
Yeah, right.
especially you know, as I mentioned. Sorry to sound like a broken record, but as best practices are changing, I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Now, does this need to be specific to use of force, or is it you know, good across the board? I mean, just generally speaking, that OPD stays you know, at the forefront of the currency of best practice in New York State.
Ideally, it would be for everything. I know this is in the context of use of force, but
yeah, no. So, Dave, do you have any thoughts?
I would be fine with that. I think what's written right now is just so it's too general, and I agree with Len that we don't want to go into a subjective zone. I would offer, though, that the fact that we're all sitting here with a lieutenant shows that we are going above and beyond the current policies and procedures, and I think that I think that with the changes that we're looking to do, I think we will be doing that. So
this is really an opportunity for us to say, you know, good job, keep it up, you know, which I think Chris probably wouldn't mind hearing. It's just a guess. Go ahead.
I kind of wordsmith some. So I have OPD will continue to develop / maintain SOP, SOGs, which follow best practices given or provided by the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Service. Chris, was there any other reference that you wanted to make on that? Is there another resource that we should be mentioning?
Well, I think that clearly staying in line with state and federal law is important.
Right, and the state follows the federal, correct?
The state can be more restrictive than
Right.
federal, but no less.
Right. So if we stay with this division of criminal justice, we fall in line with both, right? State and
Right.
federal.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
Len, if you could just do me a favor and just read that back one more time.
OPD will continue to develop / maintain SOP and SOGs, which follow best practices given or provided by New York State Division of Criminal Justice Service.
I would make a motion that we adopt that. Seconded by Len. Further discussion on this? All in favor? Okay, very good. All right. Progress. All right. We have, now we're moving to race relations, and it is letter D in race relations. And we're at 5:02. Chief, we're going to lose you in about half an hour.
That is correct.
Okay, race relations D. All right, and let me just see if I've got legal opinion on these. There.
Mark, maybe Katie could refresh my memory, but I thought she gave opinion on this one already.
I'm sorry. Who?
Sure. Well, I think I gave just a very brief opinion in that I believe that the justification for this recommendation is just based on the fact that, police officers, like many other, public employment positions, are filled based on the competitive civil service examination process, which leaves absolutely no room to consider candidates based on any other factors other than how they score on a standardized test. So I believe that the thought is that perhaps the civil service process no longer reflects the needs of the modern day workplace, vis-a-vis diversity, equity, inclusion, and other similar philosophies. So I think that, while we recognize that civil service plays an important role because it prevents abuse of political power and, political hiring and, other, horrible things, I think that there's a strong recognition. I know at least me as the person you pay to administer your civil service, sometimes I look at the regulations and I'm like, what are we doing here? Like we're clearly not, are we really hiring the best candidates we possibly can within the framework that's established for us to follow? So I think that one thing we had talked about was, lobbying, the state government to perhaps update, the state constitution, which is where civil service law originates from, to perhaps update, overhaul, not repeal, but make some very needed updates to the way that the civil service process, works.
All right, before I go to you, Luke, just because there are folks that are following along on YouTube, I just want to read what their recommendation was, and then I'll go to you, Luke. So by way of explaining where Katie was coming from, and that's that this board recommends the Common Council advocate at the state level to remove obstacles to employment that limit opportunities that are disadvantaged demographic, such as the antiquated civil service examination and appointment process. So just to give context to what Katie was talking about. Okay, go ahead, Luke.
Yes, this was one of the things we know writing this, that there's nothing we can really do at this level because it is state civil exam. One thing we talked about, again, as the mayor informed us during the process, was lobbying the state, and I'd be happy to work with Katie in drafting a letter in talking more specifically about what we can do to address some of these issues.
Okay, so Luke, what would you suggest we be looking at as a recommendation here in general? As I hear that you're willing to assist in the process, but what will a recommendation look like in your mind's eye, given what they were looking for here?
Well, I would say, and I can write this as I say it, but the board recommends that council work with the director, personnel director. Actually, I'll write it and then I'll type it in. Work with the personnel director to compose a letter about ways that we can reform or address some of these problem areas. And I can wordsmith that in a moment, but essentially, not with, obviously, we probably wouldn't recommend a particular person. I'm happy to volunteer to do it, but that council work with the personnel director to draft a letter advocating for changing points X, Y, and Z, and we can work. And whoever is doing it can work with Katie
So
to.
If we were to say, Luke, that Common Council requests the personnel director, Katie, you'll tell me if this isn't comfortable for you, to advocate at the state level to remove obstacles to employment that limit opportunities for disadvantaged demographic, period.
Yeah, I think that's good. I should also mention that this is actually an issue that's been before NICOM as one of their legislative priorities. I think, given the pandemic and other, more pressing matters, it kind of fell off their priority list. But, dealing with antiquated civil service rules is something that, as a lobbying agency for local governments, I think it's something that they're keenly aware of. So perhaps, addressing any efforts through NICOM might be a good first step.
So, and I think maybe throwing NICOM in there is not a bad idea. And actually, the Common Council advocating at the state level is fine. We can advocate at the state level and have Katie be our appointed, rabble rouser, or whomever. But so we, the Common Council's tasked with. We're saying the Common Council will advocate at the state level to remove obstacles to employment that limit opportunities for disadvantaged demographic through, maybe we don't need to throw an icon in there. I mean, it's enough that we say that probably. Len, Dave, your thoughts?
I don't really have anything to add on this. I think you're heading down the right road. I'm in agreement with everything that's been said so far.
How about you, Len?
Yeah, I was just trying to wordsmith it myself. I was hoping Dave was going to pick up on this one.
I feel like the first sentence almost takes care of it. You just get rid of the board recommends that they come and just take it from Common Council.
I think we're overthinking it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually wordsmithed, Mark, if you'd like to hear.
Go ahead.
My epiphany that I had here. Council will work with the personnel director to advocate at the state level to eliminate obstacles to employment for disadvantaged demographics in the civil service system.
I like it.
Sure.
I'll second that motion.
Good. All right. Any further discussion? No. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
You go.
And Katie, whatever way is most helpful, I don't want to get in the way.
I
didn't want to leave you out there alone. If you,
you did. That was good, man. That was good. Okay. So that is that takes us into, that was 3D, correct?
Yep.
Got a little lost here for a minute, but okay. So we can look at. Yeah, no, we're not going to look at A yet. Let's look at 4B. So this is civilian oversight and community involvement, which I don't have multiple screens, but God knows I got enough else. All right, what did you say was 4B? While this, civilian oversight and community involvement, B. While this board acknowledges that the police chief hiring process is largely controlled by the previously mentioned antiquated civil service process, this board recommends the Common Council advocate at the state level for amending or eliminating the examination requirements for any future police chiefs. Given the nature of this important public safety position, to the extent permitted by current law, the selection of a police chief should include input and participation by community stakeholders with full representation of the broader community. I think, I'll just check the legal opinion on this to see if we do have any, and we don't there, and we don't there. So Katie, I think you're up.
So I guess if we break this down into two parts, it sounds like it's really two recommendations pertaining to, the police chief. It talks about, again, they're recognizing that, examination requirements for a police chief won't necessarily yield the best candidate. That's nothing that's within the city's control. That would be part of the lobbying effort that we talked about. Again, it states in the New York State Constitution that all public employees, shall be appointed solely based on merit and fitness, relative merit and fitness or whatever. So if a position is deemed by the State Civil Service Commission to be testable or have testable functions, then there's really no way that we can get out of, having it done. So I think that part kind of falls in with what we were talking about in the prior recommendation. The second part of it about, having, it sounds like there should be community, like what they're looking for is community input and representation from the broader community in terms of hiring an important department head level position like the police chief, which of course has a significant amount of community impact. So I would suggest that, I hate to keep saying, well, we already have the existing framework to do it, but, the city charter allows the mayor to establish and appoint members to an ad hoc community for a variety of purposes. And I think that appointing a search committee or an interview panel that could include people from the community at large would certainly not be outside of the realm of possibility or appropriateness. So I think that I know that we're talking about police right now, but I think that would apply to other important department head level public safety positions like fire chief, et cetera. But again, we're talking about police. So I think that recommendation could be met by invoking that section of the charter and having perhaps a policy adopted by the council that would just indicate that, an ad hoc search committee shall be appointed by the mayor whenever there is a need to, when a vacancy in the office of police chief arises or something to that extent. That would be my recommendation.
But civil service law would supersede that as of right now.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not explaining this appropriately. We are encumbered by the civil service process, meaning that we would still have to post the exam, give the exam, establish the list based on the scores, but then the candidates who are on that list could then be considered by a public panel to be appointed by the mayor and then could interview those people. So it's not going to change the requirements to take the test or get the people on the list. But once those folks actually are on an established civil service list from a competitive examination, then those people could be considered by a larger body if that's something that the council is interested in doing. I guess maybe I'm still not explaining this because Dave's giving me the look. Okay, so let me give you.
No, you know what? I understand. I'm thinking back to the history of civil service and why it started and where it started, and we have to be careful that we're not going completely full circle here, because the way it started was your friend wanted to be police chief or fire chief or whatever, and so Tammany Hall would say, you go to Tammany Hall and they would say, well, give me $100 and I'll appoint you. And then that person's appointed. And so it was really to avoid all these horrible processes that happened decades and decades and decades ago. So I agree with having community input, but we just have to be careful where we're going with that. I think if it's community input that's fed back to the common council and the mayor to then make the hire, or the city administrator to make the hire, I would be okay with that. But the civil service, I mean, we're also in Oneonta. What's the likelihood of, let's say we're hiring a police chief or a fire chief, how many people are we going to have take that exam and be on the list? So
You're right, David. It is. This recommendation came from the folks at NAACP. This was something that they felt particularly was important. I do too, for that matter, but also appreciate what you're saying. Theoretically, though, the top 3 or 4 or 5 folks that would be on that list would be potentially all at least greatly qualified to be here. So having a chance for the community to look over those 5 that have already been approved for potentially all of them being hired for the position, I think would be a great way to build community trust.
So what do we got here then?
So
We have the
rather,
one piece-
rather than creating an ad hoc committee,
Right, that's kind of where I was going.
couldn't we just add a community stakeholder to participate in the interview process along with, let's just think about this out loud, the mayor, individuals from the common council, or all of them, they're always given the opportunity, the union, who else would participate in the interview process? Wouldn't it be just a little bit easier, instead of creating a separate ad hoc, that we just add 1 or 2 community members, stakeholders to this interview process?
You were going down the same road I was, but you weren't. I was thinking, frankly, that Katie's thought and applicable to any number of other positions that have, significant public interest, makes some sort of sense. But where I kind of got off on a different road was the idea that maybe this isn't a committee, commission, or group that the mayor appoints, but rather it's, again, we're going to get into the appendix. We may very well be looking at either the group or maybe a combination of groups, if there are in fact 2, that the lieutenant's already working with, who would have an investment in, having, a well-formed opinion, certainly, about who might step into the position. And in fact, there may be, as we look at the appendix, a role for a committee, if in fact a committee winds up coming into being. So I almost feel like this is something that we might want to just revisit when we get to the other side of the appendix, from my perspective.
Okay,
No,
so
you're
legally, Katie, legally, who is supposed to do the interviewing from your perspective?
From my perspective, legally, we have a charter that indicates that the city administrator is the person that appoints all department head level positions. But that does not mean that the city administrator could not take into consideration other feedback in making that decision.
Right.
But if we're going to be consistent with the letter of the Oneonta law, we have a charter that says that it's the city administrator, subject to confirmation by the common council.
So we would be talking about interspersing some other interview in the process.
Potentially.
I just wanted to say that we also have a committee or a board that we have currently, the Human Rights Board, that could be considered to be the one that gives an opinion.
Yeah, and or representatives. Right now, the mayor is sitting in interviews of the next college president. He is not going to be the guy making the decision. He's just a guy. But he was invited because his opinion was valued, and the city, because of that, has some skin in the game. And I think that's where I am leaning with this. The first part of it about the civil service piece, we've addressed this already. The second piece, relative to community input into decision making, input at a level where their opinions are provided and respected and inform potentially the ultimate decision, but that ultimate decision still lies within the, within the structure that, that it does. It's not, we're not going to change the structure for opinions or for decisions on the hiring of the police chief or anybody for that matter, but taking in the opinion of people who have something to bring to the process makes some sort of sense.
All right, so I guess, Mark, with that said, if we just think of a community stakeholder that could be added into this process, like Gary is with SUNY
Well, I think
Indiana.
that's what I was saying. We table this and look at this is a case where the appendix might inform some of our decisions about other things. We may do nothing with what's been offered in the appendix, or we may. But this, I think, might be one of the places where there may be a likely intersection of, roles. And we can, so I'm just saying, I'm going to basically say table and, come back to it, if that works for everybody. Dave, that work for you? Okay. All right. We are moving to 4D. And that is that, again, this is civilian oversight and community involvement. This board recommends the Common Council adopt a policy or procedure to allow for community feedback in the city administrator's annual performance evaluation of the police chief.
Did we ever get an opinion on that, Mark, from Dave Merzig?
I'm looking, no, not from Dave, we didn't. And I'm looking to see if we got an opinion from anybody else on it. And I don't see that we did here. And I don't know that we did there. No, we didn't. So we have no legal opinions on this. Do we? I mean, we do expect Dave. I'm surprised that he wasn't a part of this, Dave Merzig, to rejoin us. Or is this something that we can tackle? We did assign this to legal opinion and don't have any. I would be curious, though, Katie, from my own perspective, you guys will just indulge me on hearing from Katie on this.
When is hearing from me ever an indulgence, is what I'd like to know. I'm trying to buy myself a minute to look this up, because there is, so the police chief, even though it is an important public safety position, falls under the Administrative Personnel Manual as adopted by the council. The Administrative Personnel Manual says that all employees are entitled to an annual performance evaluation, but it does not prescribe or specify what the form is, what the process is, what the means are to do the vehicle for that evaluation. So I think that, I wish I could just find it.
But it also comes down to, is the city administrator's annual performance evaluation of the police chief, how confidential is it?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was at too, quite honestly.
I think that there's ability to do a 360-degree review and to do it in a manner that is confidential and sensitive. So I think that it would just be a matter of finding the right method. Yeah, so it says Article 11 of the admin manual just says each employee covered by this manual is subject to review on an annual basis, period. That's all it says. So
Dave, you're muted. Oh, you're talking to somebody else. Okay. Luke, Len? Yeah, Len.
I guess I would want to have Dave Merzig give us a written opinion on this, because I just don't see where their evaluation can be released to the public. I mean, you think of every executive session we go into is because we're talking about personnel issues. You're not allowed to even reveal the employee's name.
That's exactly where I was with this.
So I just don't see where we can release this type of information.
well, Len, I'm sorry to interrupt. I guess I read it a little differently, and I apologize if I misinterpreted what the recommendation was. I thought that what the CAB had requested was the ability to provide feedback in the process, not necessarily be privy to the review. But
maybe that's right. Luke, is that what the way you see it as well? Which does change
Yes, it
the
does.
dynamic of
Yes.
that. If it's a case of, okay, you know, maybe we want to hear from this group or, you know, this individual as to what they think, and then that is provided to Greg. And he then, that informs or doesn't, his review. Yes, Dave.
Then I would recommend that we table this until we decide on what we want to do in the appendix.
Yep. Okay.
Because that could very well tie into whatever we decide there.
Very well. Okay, very good. All right, so that, anybody?
I mean, if everybody agrees with that.
Yeah,
anyway.
I do.
Yeah, I do as well. Len, you concur? Move it to, we want to get Dave Mertzig's opinion, potentially, although now that I've reimagined it based on Katie's and Luke's view of it as being something that more informs Greg's overall, as opposed to something that Greg is sharing his information. It's a kind of a different thing.
And I agree that we should table this, but for me, I would just like to throw out, as I read that, instead of feedback, is it better to say community input?
Yes, absolutely.
If that's, Luke, what you guys wanted, you
Yeah.
wanted input, not feedback, because feedback means that you're receiving the information from the city
Right.
administrator about the police chief's annual performance evaluation, and I just don't see how legally you can have that.
That was the intent.
It does make
What
a
you
big
said,
difference.
not the illegal part.
Yeah. So we'll look at the appendix piece and we'll solicit Dave Mertzig's opinion on this as well. There may be other legals that still haven't been answered, but we do have one more. Chief, I think we're just about to lose you. Right?
Yeah, I've got to be out of here by 5:30.
Okay. Well, listen, you know, thank you for being with us today and for, you know, God, a lot of patience you've been showing. Yeah, so I
Got a
appreciate
lot of experience.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we're gonna let you go, and we're gonna plow on to drug policy, mental health counseling, and poverty, and see whether or not we can make any headway with that. Thanks an awful lot.
You bet. Have a great night.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks, Chief.
Bye now.
Okay, so this is the question under drug policy, mental health counseling, and poverty, and this is the only legal opinion question that we have left, which is kind of great. And that is that this board recommends that the city of Oneonta adopt a policies such as the Blueprint for Public Health and Safety Approach to Drug Policy, published by the New York Academy of Medicine and Drug Policy Institute, see Appendix 1, the link to the full document. The proposed strategy centers around adopting a health and safety approach based on a 4-pillar strategy of prevention, treatment, and recovery, harm reduction, and public safety. And I'm wondering why we need an legal opinion for that. But I don't know that, Katie, this is something that you want to or need to weigh in on. I think this is just.
I can assure you that I will be no help here. I
Yeah,
apologize.
this is essentially, they're asking the city of Oneonta to adopt this policy or a policy that is similar to this public health and safety approach to drug policy. Luke?
Yeah, so this is a really you know, we were talking about some of the root problems to a lot root causes to a lot of the problems we face, and a lot of it has to do with you know, there is so much poverty in the city. I think that these 4 pillars, and I'm happy to send you the executive summary. It's only about 2 or 3 pages. It's kind of a big idea kind of thing. It's not so much as writing a rule saying that we will adopt the 4 policies. A lot of this is very much so a macro view of things and looking at how we can, as a city, at least if I understand it correctly, from the meetings, kind of tackle these issues from a policy perspective. And a lot of, like I said, a lot of the issues that we face as a city, a lot of the crime, a lot of the suffering is a result of our poverty, right? And looking at things we can do to alleviate that. It's
So
which is
Luke-
easier to do when the document's in front of
Yeah, do we have a local expert on this policy in the city? Would you say there's
Like a
somebody-
certified expert? I don't believe so. We have a couple of folks that were on the committee that researched quite a bit about this that we can consult. But in terms of
my point, I think, is this, that it sounds like this doesn't sound like there's for me anyway, it doesn't seem like there's a huge legal issue in this. It sounds more like is this something that as this committee understands what's being presented as a potential policy and educational piece, that that we fully understand what it is, and in understanding, maybe we can either advocate for it or not. It certainly seems benign enough. Go ahead, Len.
Luke, this document, is it meant for police departments or is this for mental health?
I think it's it's mental health, but within the view of police departments and city governance, for that matter. So I think this recommendation might be if I recall correctly, it might be as much for OPD as well as Common Council working together.
Katie, are you at all familiar with this?
I'm not, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I wonder, Luke, so I think there are two ways of going with this, and I might be wrong. I'm just one voice out of the four here, but I feel like there's a knowledge base that needs to be shared and understood before this can be moved forward. And I wonder if it's something that, first of all, you can share with Katie so that she has some background in this, because it would, I think, behoove us to have her opinion based on that level of insight. And I wonder, if it makes sense. We are having one person come back off of 1A to speak, and we'll have to come up with a contradicting voice as well, so that we can get a well-informed discussion among this committee. And it may, if we're going to do that, it may have value to set aside a similar amount of time for somebody to make a presentation along these lines, if there aren't any legal issues with it.
Yeah, that sounds good. And if I recall correctly, and it's a little hazy, I think the person that would be talking on the ring was one that did a lot of research into this too. So we might not to say two birds with one stone, but kind of two birds with one stone.
Yeah, we can say that. Len, Dave, you got thoughts?
Not at this point.
Okay.
Not anything different than that's already been said.
Yeah, Len?
I'm looking at I got on the link.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to find this document.
Yeah. So I would suggest first, we have, we may have to do a double up. We did wind up losing a meeting at one point, or the bulk of a meeting at one point. But Luke, I think we have enough time that if you can get this information to Katie, number one. So I'm sorry to do that to you, Katie, because I know you got other stuff, but I think it's important that you at least see this. Does that sound right to you? You okay with that? Okay. Yeah, so if you can get that to Katie to begin with, and we can get, some basic, some input from Katie, maybe at our next meeting around that. Not that you have to be an expert in it, Katie, but just to, have looked at it at least. And then we can kind of determine, what do we want to do after that? Do we want to bring somebody to it? In the meantime, there was this question about legal. Yes, go ahead, Luke.
I was just going to let Katie know. I sent you the link. It has the executive summary as well as the whole document, whatever works for us.
And again, there was a question as to whether or not there's a legal issue around this. I will reach out to Dave Mertzig for his opinion if he's got one, and at the very least we can get that, and then we can hopefully address this particular piece at our next meeting. If we then decide that we want to bring your person in and do a double, we are still going to need to have some advocate for the opposite side of the conversation, to be fair. Okay, so we'll have to give some thought to that as well, please. Okay, that makes sense? Okay. All right, here's what I'd like to do. I know this seems sneaky, but because the discussion of the appendix is going to be most caustic to our chief of police, and he's not here, and we have 25 minutes to play with. At this point, I think if you guys don't mind, I wouldn't mind taking a look at the appendix.
Sure.
What do you think, Dave? Len?
I'd like to have an endpoint before we start delving into that.
Well, I think we
That's
did.
a big discussion.
Didn't we just get to an endpoint? That's the last of
No,
our.
wait, you're talking about starting the discussion on the appendix right now?
Yeah, we take a look at it.
As long as we have an endpoint.
The endpoint is 6 o'clock. Give me a sense of what you think an endpoint looks like, because it may not be the same as mine.
I was thinking the endpoint could be now. Because we've got another 2 hours tonight.
I feel you. I just want to be done. All right.
I know. But you know what? We get done when we get done. I'd rather
I know. And
give
you-
it a good solid document than rush it.
That's right. For you folks watching on YouTube, no, we're not rushing nothing. I'm not looking to get done. We just want to get it.
Right.
done.
No, I hear you.
Right. Okay. So with that, unless there's something else that we need to discuss right now, and then you're being paged anyway.
I was just gonna say.
Behind you.
Just a quick thank you to everyone again, and Katie especially, for your help with advocacy and in looking at the blueprint.
Yeah, it's been a good committee. Honestly, it's been a thorough series of conversations, and I appreciate it. So with that, let's call it done. I'll see everybody at 7 o'clock, I guess, and we should though pick it up. We'll see about getting the couple of legal opinion recommendation pieces squared away first with our next meeting, and then let's launch into the appendix. Okay.
So Mark,
Yes,
before we say goodbye, I just want to get some clarity. So on Appendix 1, if we're looking to weigh in on that.
No, it's Appendix 2, I think it is.
Appendix 2.
Yep.
Okay.
There's multiple proposals in Appendix 2.
Right.
Appendix 1.
I was just curious
a
of what the
back.
committee thought we were going to talk about with Appendix 1, because they're just references.
Yeah, no. My bad. I just walked past Appendix 1 being all the,
You're welcome to check for plagiarism, Len. That might be the meeting to see if we plagiarized them.
I'll be doing that. Anyway, no, it'll be the second appendix that's got the proposals.
Well, I guess I just a little bit more clarity. We'll go to Appendix 2. Is it of this committee's general opinion that this group will make the decision of which proposal? Because I've had myself other conversations with the other 4, at least two out of the other 4. They want to weigh in on that.
Well, we can have that discussion. I mean, I don't have I don't have a horse in this race. We can open up the discussion, determine what we want to do, and do it. So we can either decide on what one thing that we think is preeminently the best bet, and provide those other options. I do want to present council with something that's done, however.
Well, one thing we could go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to add to what Mark said. It's one thing we could do is we look at these proposals, and it could be the 4 of us just come to an agreement, a general agreement of what we're looking for, and present that to the council. And then as 8 of us, we can decide what we want to put into that.
Yep.
And if I'm not mistaken, anyone on council can pull an item from these recommendations for discussion, or further debate.
I don't know, Luke, because we've been talking along that we want to come up with a final document that we're going to hand over to the council to have discussion on. Whereas what you're suggesting is that those council members that aren't part of this committee would get to go back to this report and start pulling things, and we'd have to rediscuss them all. So
Len, this could be something we pull out completely from the
Could be
document
two. Could be two.
and then do a presentation to the council and say, look, this is what we are thinking, a loose direction that we want to go, but we need to work on it and decide as a group what we want to do.
Right. And I've identified, I think, 4 or 5 of these recommendations that are potentially connective to a third party, whether it's the one that the chief has built or it's one that is advocated for in the, in the appendix. And, so there are things, basically, I feel like if we can provide the council with a finished plan, which we will, with timelines, which we will, and then we can provide them with fodder for discussion with our recommendations.
Which is what I was going to say. And thank you for Mark and Dave saying it without mumbling or stuttering through it. Guy would have.
All right, listen, anyway, we are getting closer to 7 o'clock, so I'm going to let everybody go. Thanks all, and we'll
Thanks,
see you in
everybody.
4 hours.